To you and you only, I look for help to make America a proud, rich land again. You have been scorned. They thought you were the lower classes. They said you are no good because you are poor. I tell you that you are, ever since yesterday noon, the highest lords of the land, the aristocracy, the makers of the new America of freedom and justice. Boys, I need you. Help me. Help me to help you. Stand fast. Anybody tries to block you, give the swine the point of your bayonet. A machine gunner MM, who had listened reverently, let loose. The mob began to drop, and into the backs of the wounded as they went staggering away, the MM infantry, running, poked their bayonets. Such a juicy squash it made, and the fugitives looked so amazed, so funny, as they tumbled in grotesque heaps. The MMs hadn't, in jury hours of bayonet drill, known this would be such sport. They'd have more of it now, and hadn't the President of the United States himself told each of them, personally, that he needed their aid? Though not perhaps his best or perhaps most famous work, Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel is nonetheless, to me, the seminal novel of Lewis's career. While Main Street may have more vividly drawn characters and settings, be more accessible and relatable, It Can't Happen Here is the novel I think of more often, and, well, more and more often. Pretty well received at the time of its release, It Can't Happen Here is still often the subject of praise and positivity if it happens to come up in conversation. And yet, it pains me how little this novel does seem to come up in conversation. Maybe I'm just, not in the right circles, but I can't say I've ever stumbled across another Lewis enjoyer chomping at the bit to dig into the characterization of American Senator Berzelius Buzz Windrip, or explore similarities to other demagogues, both real and fictional, just kind of in the wild. I'm not about to make the case that Windrip and his story are soon to be forgotten or neglected, but I think this book lives in the same space occupied by novels such as All the King's Men, and yet doesn't quite get the same due or buzz. Why is this? Honestly, I don't know. And honestly, I don't really care. I don't think that such treatment is exclusive to this novel. Instead, I think this treatment characterizes the genre this novel occupies. Specifically, fictional depictions of countries, real or imagined, slipping into fascism. I'm going to be a little reductive here, as usual, but in popular culture and literature, including literature turned into film, authors, and therefore readers, or the other way around, seem much less interested in exploring how fascist regimes come to be, and instead tend to focus on how fascist regimes fall apart. Given that it's arguably more important and likely to stop the rise of fascism than it is to topple fascism, why is this? Why do we focus on overthrowing fascist regimes rather than maintaining democratic ones? I think the answer is pretty simple, honestly. To most people, overthrowing a fascist regime is more interesting. Writing about it is also, well, a lot simpler. Let's look at some examples. First, of course, I want to focus on Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games trilogy. When it comes to dystopian lit, particularly popular young adult dystopian lit, The Hunger Games is kind of like the big daddy of them all. The Hunger Games provided the blueprint for everything from The Maze Runner to, Divergent, for better or worse. Collins created a fairly simple model, and a lot of people occupied this model without understanding what actually made it work, while simultaneously stripping it of its actual complexities and boiling it down to something so bare bones that eventually even the young audience woke up to the sham and rejected it about halfway through the Divergent film series. And to be clear, not that Suzanne Collins invented this genre, I'm just saying that she popularized older forms of it and made it accessible to a new audience, particularly young adult readers. So in short, the Hunger Games model pretty much looks like this. The story takes place sometime, somewhere, in a distant, but not really too distant future. The people are kind of like us, but exaggerated enough that we don't feel quite too guilty by seeing ourselves portrayed on screen. The protagonist is an unlikely everyday person just trying to live out their life when they're swept into rebellion as a result of their just everyday normal personness. They're easy to latch onto, especially given the first-person perspective. Next, the government is unequivocally bad. The closest the government or its leader can ever get to sympathy or nuance is an easily debunked the ends justify the means position that the morally rigid protagonist just has no time for. Then, of course, the rebellion sweeps in, overthrows the objectively evil government, and reinstates a democracy. Happy ending. This is also similar to things that you would see in like Star Wars or even Lord of the Rings. This is also present in other classics like Narnia and The Handmaid's Tale. I'm just picking on The Hunger Games because I think it's the biggest culprit for the current fixation on dystopia toppling rather than dystopia prevention. It's also, however, the only franchise trying to turn this ship around. I also want to commend The Hunger Games for a piece of nuance other franchises like Divergent or Star Wars lack, and that's the ending. In Mockingjay, when Katniss is supposed to be executing President Snow, she instead chooses to execute President Alma Coin, which was her plan all along, and leaves Snow to the thriving masses of Panem, where he is then killed and ripped apart similar to somebody like Benito Mussolini. Katniss chooses to kill Coin because Coin, in her first day as self-appointed president-elect, is already beginning to perpetuate the same cycle of violence as Snow. Katniss realizes that Coin is just as bad as Snow, despite being part of the rebellion. Additionally, Katniss's disillusionment with her close friend Gale and the rebellion in general stems from the war crimes employed against the capital, which resulted in the death of her sister, Prim. Or, as The Who would say, I love this decision on Colin's part because she accurately highlights the paradox of rebellions. The new guys replacing the bad guys are seldom any better than the bad guys. This adds a bit of nuance and realism and complexity to the conflict that government bad, rebellion good just can't. But why does it matter? Why bring any of it up? Well, because the cultural effect of books like The Hunger Games has been that readers walk away with the message that you should defy authority and nothing else. Yes, it is good to question authority, and it's always good to question fascism, but the issue is that in the real world, most people don't actually recognize fascism or genuinely harmful authority until it literally bites them in the ass. And actually, well, usually not even then. This stems from a lot of things, but really, I think part of it comes down to a good old case of, it's not fascist when my side does it. If it's something I like, that's not fascism. Because the real world is so complex, every nation, of course, has different conversations about what fascism actually is or looks like. And invariably, all examples or definitions will probably come back to places like Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, or North Korea. But again, the problem is that most people, book and movie guy included, are not political scientists or historians. Because of this, they can only recognize fascism when it's already happened, when it can be directly compared to something the Nazis did. And still, even then, a lot of people just don't get it. In staying connected to literature and not diving too deeply into just pure politics, I think a lot of this stems from literature and media, which, again, only focuses on overthrowing fascist regimes and not actually preventing them. We all know that a hardcore, black and white, objectively evil fascist regime looks a specific way, but a lot of people struggle harder when it comes to recognizing fascism as it spreads. Why? Because again, it's a lot easier to understand and be motivated by one than the other. The image of a friend being whipped in public for doing the right thing and ethical questions about whether or not we would step in are much easier to ponder than abstract questions about whether or not we would go to the polls to vote for a nobody candidate in a runoff election who may or may not vote to protect access to a specific thing which only benefits a specific group of people under a specific set of circumstances, none of which apply directly to us. And yet, these specific decisions and circumstances are what lead to gradual fascist takeovers. This is where I want to take a moment to point out that for readers of nonfiction, there is plenty of great content out there about this very thing. While definitely not the only example out there, the one which immediately comes to mind for me is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shire. Sort of like the book, at least of its time, on Nazi Germany, this absolute brick of a text is extremely detailed, dense, and at times fairly difficult to get through. It's not exactly light reading, and yet it's an extremely illuminating text which covers all the very things popular fiction tends not to. The gritty details of politics that, while boring taken one at a time, amount to, well, fascism. This is largely why authors, and therefore readers, tend not to be interested in such topics, fascinating as they may be to anyone who has an interest in history, political science, or, trying to live in a free and democratic society. Another anecdote I want to add about Shire's magnum opus is this. If you read it, people will call you a Nazi. It's just that simple. Now, to be clear, I do think that we should call out neo-Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. Those people are way too comfortable in 2024 saying their stupid things that they say. It doesn't happen enough, actually, that they're called out, but it's also important to be academic and not oversaturate the term or accusation. Nonetheless, the copy of this book, which I checked out from my local library, and I think every copy of it ever, has just like a massive swastika stomped right on the front, the side, and the back. Maybe I'm just naive or stupid, but when I was perusing The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I wasn't really anticipating any attention or pushback because of this. Like, to me, it was just a history book, and, well, as happens from time to time, it turns out that I was wrong. I did get pushback. So I had the book with me at work one day when I was a manager at my local movie theater. I left it on a table of personal items behind the box office, and my friend selling tickets actually had to, like, hide the book because so many customers saw it and got angry at her. One dude actually claimed that it was his and that he lost it in an attempt to, like, take it and destroy it. It was very weird. And look, general movie-going audience, I know you're not very smart in general, and I appreciate the sentiment, but chill the fuck out. I bring this story up because I think it's a symptom of politically charged, like, anti-intellectualism. When I'm reading a 1,000-plus page book titled The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich in an attempt to learn how to recognize the signs of fascism, and the average person can't get past a swastika on the cover and then accuses me of being the Nazi while they attempt to ban a book, I have a hard time having faith in our ability as a nation to actually recognize or combat genuine fascism. This also stems from this, like, general misconception that an interest in something equals you supporting something. I mean, even doing something as innocuous as reading a biography on every US president will get you hate when you put a book about an unpopular president on your Christmas list. It's just so frustrating to me that we're at a point where most people can't separate academic interest or study, especially the preventative kind, from support of the topic being studied. Maybe it's unpopular to say what I'm about to say, but I'm gonna say it anyway. When it comes to both media comprehension and social engagement, the average person has to be tricked into liking or doing the right thing. With media, the average viewer has to be tricked into finding something relatable, especially if the subject matter is a minority group of some kind. For example, as much as I love Wind River and Hostiles, as I mention all the time, I think there are specific marketing reasons that those films choose to focus on a traditional white male protagonist instead of, like, a native one. Now, this also tells the viewer that the plight of native peoples belongs to more than just natives, but projects like this don't catch nearly the same amount of controversy as films which do focus on a minority lead. This connects to the ability of the audience to see themselves represented in media, and when looking at media through the lens of fascism, not see themselves in media. In an interview for his 2016 novel, The Underground Railroad, author Colson Whitehead addressed his depiction of slave owners as non-cartoonishly evil monsters. Traditional slave narratives focus on cruel plantation owners who whip and abuse their slaves, such as, like, Michael Fassbender's character in 12 Years a Slave. And I remember Whitehead making the point somewhere that when you portray slave owners as exclusively violent, inaccessible monsters, it's very easy for the viewer to distance themselves from that portrayal and let themselves off the hook for whatever the modern equivalent is, because, well, I'm not a slave owner, I'm not a monster. The same goes for Nazis and other fascists. Because I'm not literally killing Jewish people, I can't be a Nazi. Another reason I think we ignore fascism in media is because portraying its rise is so difficult. Rarely does fascism just happen. It's incremental, such as Umberto Eco points out in his 14 characteristics of fascism. Instead, people assume fascism just happens with the flip of a switch, such as in the most popular story about the rise of fascism, the Star Wars prequels. There is really not a slow rise to power for Palpatine here. Like, there sort of is, and there's all these conversations and movies about, like, taxes and whatever, but it's not the focus of the story. While the films do spend a lot of time on government, decisions and things that are part of Palpatine's plan, the actual Galactic Empire stuff is pretty much limited to the final film and the final act of it, at which point, yeah, Palpatine is cartoonishly evil.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
I actually think the best conversation about fascism in the prequel trilogy is in Attack of the Clones, when Anakin and Padme are in the meadow, and Anakin says,
The trouble is that people don't always agree.
Well, then they should be made to.
By whom? Who's gonna make them?
I don't know. Someone.
You?
Someone wise.
Though not particularly overt about it, I do think there is another popular novel out there which does a great job of summarizing the psychology behind why and how fascism spreads. The novel is one of my favorites, and it's William Golding's seminal work, Lord of the Flies. Very influenced by his time in World War II, the thing which sets Golding apart from most authors is his unwillingness to let the reader off the hook. Instead of playing tricks or giving the reader a clear moral character to not be, Golding is extremely clear about fascism and all other human ills. Maybe there is a beast. Maybe it's only us. Everyone likes to think they would be Ralph or Simon or Piggy, but Golding makes the case, and correctly I think, that everyone is really more like Jack, or at the very least, Sam and Eric, or Maurice, or Roger. The kids who maybe don't explicitly do anything bad the whole time, but who let the guy who will do something bad gain and maintain power. Golding's antagonist, Jack, is a classic demagogue who maintains power by keeping the boys afraid of a threat which isn't even real, the Beast. And instead of encouraging the boys to focus on elements of civilization and rescue, Jack maintains popularity through brute force and by tricking the boys into thinking he can deliver more than Ralph. How does he do this? By providing them with short-term rewards, defiant promises, and a rejection of abstract ideas they can't quite understand, such as rescue. Or, as Mr. Lewis would have put it, I tell you that you are, ever since yesterday noon, the highest lords of the land, the aristocracy, the makers of the new America of freedom and justice. Boys, I need you. Help me to help you. Stand fast. Anybody tries to block you, give the swine the point of your bayonet. I think the similarities in this passage to Lord of the Flies are pretty obvious. It is this mentality which eventually leads to the overt grip fascism can take on characters or people. Opposition is crushed, as we see in Lord of the Flies. Literally. And eventually, people settle into a form of complacency where they opt not to speak out against crippling systems because it's easier for them to live their lives without shaking the boat and hope they never have to face the consequences. A story about this exact premise, also from the 1950s, big surprise, is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. The Lottery focuses on a town where, once a year, names are drawn from a box, and the winner is stoned to death. Jackson's main character, Tessie, arrives at the drawing happy and bubbly, unconcerned with what's going to happen. She makes jokes about her dishes and laundry, but quickly changes her attitude when her family draws the black spot, and she's put up for the stoning. As soon as Tessie realizes that she's going to be impacted by the lottery, she insists that the entire charade is cruel and unfair, things which weren't really on her mind when she thought someone else was going to be killed. There are several important elements at play here. Firstly, no one in the story even remembers why the lottery happens. There are suggestions, but one of the major themes is to always question traditions. Outside of a few mutters, the characters have become complacent in their relationship to the lottery, and the elderly especially defend with the mentality of, it's always been this way. If I have to do it, then you have to do it. What I think is more interesting and important in this story, however, is its portrayal of empathy, or lack thereof, and considering how that contributes to the spread of, or maintaining of, fascism. This is, of course, all very in line with the Martin Niemöller poem, First They Came. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. This also connects back to that idea of incremental fascism, that certain people or rights are targeted piece by piece until there's nothing left for anyone. Why? Because, again, people and characters are tricked into thinking that what's happening isn't about them, or that they aren't part of the problem. In the film Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, there is a wonderful quote from Dumbledore that I always show my students at the beginning of the year.
Dark forces attempt to penetrate this castle's walls, but in the end, their greatest weapon is you.
I love this quote because it's so in line with Golding's thesis that the beast is us, and also refuses to let the viewer off the hook. I think this adds a lot to the overall narrative of Harry Potter and how it tries to tackle what is really, at the end of the day, a story about fascism, for as much as Rowling might like to pretend otherwise these days. Similar to some of the other properties like Star Wars or Divergent or the Hunger Games, though most of the bad guys in Harry Potter are just bad. Many of them are cartoons, and you can tell that they're bad because, well, they look bad. In other words, the fascists wear black robes, and because I don't wear black robes, I'm not a fascist. This gets a little more nuanced in the final two installments, as you can see in the scene with the whole character of Snape and Draco, but it's easy to not identify with Voldemort because, at the very least, he's literally disfigured by how evil he is. What I think makes the second half of this franchise work where so many others fail is in its deconstruction of its own premises. Voldemort can only come to and maintain power because people, such as Draco or Snape, choose to follow him, and if the average person doesn't let evil or hate or fear into their heart, well, evil can never take root. There's a beautiful scene in the fifth installment when Sirius tells Harry that
The world isn't split into good people and Death Eaters. We've all got both light and dark inside of us.
I love this quote because it once again holds the audience somewhat responsible. We all have the ability to be good or evil depending on our choices. Therefore, we cannot be let off the hook because we are always good or always bad. Which we decide to be depends on the people or systems we decide to let into our hearts. Do we give in to the beast, as Jack and the boys do in Lord of the Flies, or do we allow ourselves to stand up for others, as they fail to do in The Lottery? A final experiment on this topic I just have to bring up is The Wave, conducted by a high school teacher named Ron Jones in 1967. Jones was a social studies teacher in California, and his students were covering the Holocaust. Somewhere along the line, one of Jones's students asked him how regular people could go along with the Nazis' plan. In response, Jones decided to show his students that the Nazis were the regular people. Jones began his experiment by giving his class minor things to gravitate around. He gave them a symbol, he gave them rigid procedures to follow, he gave some of them roles of power which placed them above others, he excluded people who weren't part of the class, he promised them that they were all part of something bigger, that this was just the first step in something more important. However, it wasn't long before his experiment got out of hand, and Jones had to shut it down. Fights were breaking out around the school, and his organization, called The Wave, was becoming harmful and distracting. Jones ended his experiment by calling all the students into the auditorium of the school and revealing to them that they would have made really great Nazis, and showing them how easy it was for the average person to be swept into fascism a little at a time, especially if those people are being told that they are not the fascists and are in fact fighting the fascists. And yet, during the entire charade, there was hardly a single student who officially would have considered them a fascist. After all, the fascists wear black robes, and my robe is white. Therefore, I am not a fascist. But lastly, I have to note, it's 2024. The way we talk about and view fascism is changing. While yes, most people deny being a fascist or deny wanting to be a fascist, we have a sad amount of people who are proudly displaying the fact that they are indeed fascists. People love a strongman, as seen in Lord of the Flies. It can't happen here. All the King's Men and the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. People want the trains running on time. Democracy is a difficult and messy thing, and it turns out that the average person doesn't want choice, only the illusion of it. Again, they have to be tricked. So what's the solution? Would a wider variety of media covering the rise of fascism help to stop the spread of it? I mean, yeah, probably, but maybe not. Popular books like The Handmaid's Tale do make an attempt at covering this issue and frequently get, banned as a result, but I also can't just pretend that people understand the media they consume. I can already see film bros identifying with fascist characters as literally me's, like Paul Atreides, based on the comments they made in my last video about literally me characters. Because of that, things ain't looking too bright for the media literacy of our young men out there, which of course makes them prime candidates for being duped into and indoctrinated by fascist media and figures, believe it or not. So, how does it happen here? A lot of different ways, but I think the chief way is due to a lack of conversation about how it happens here. People have an aversion to content which makes them uncomfortable, especially if it's content they see themselves in. This is why there's been such a pushback against works like The Handmaid's Tale, or a sudden rejection of uncomfortable historical topics and conversations in places like Florida. It's much easier, and for the average person therefore much more enjoyable, to consume media where the bad guys are so unlike us we can never be them, or more and more often lately, where the bad guy is right because the bad guy is cool. All of this stems from a wider lack of empathy and understanding of how our actions in the world impact others. And at the end of the day, fascism can only really take root as a result of people lacking empathy, or, as Dumbledore would say, taking root in the hearts of
all those who live without love.
Just something to think about.